Well, the flying saucer myths, there's not a single verified or checked out report which is at all connectable with the possibility of extraterrestrial life. It's all very pseudo-scientific.
UFOlogy is a mythology that's based on superstition, wrapped inside a fairy tale, telling a story that's simply not true.
There, of course, has been a stigma towards the scientific study of UFOs. This is something that has been essentially a taboo for many, many decades. To talk about this as a scientist may have been considered professional suicide.
Maybe you can just set up, the term abduction.
I don't want to talk about abductions.
If you could give an overview of the major high watermarks of the anecdotals.
Yeah, that's what I don't want to talk about.
Okay.
Can we skip these questions?
Sure.
Oh, God, do I really want to say anything?
Oh, I'll tell you something off camera.
Okay.
Okay.
Since 2017 and the articles that were published in the New York Times, it was an occasion when more scientists became aware that unidentified aerial phenomena could justify a scientific investigation.
We are now no longer talking about whether there are UFOs, UAP. The question now is, what are these things and where are they coming from?
We don't know what these things are. I mean, who couldn't be interested in this?
We are trying to bring this subject to the mainstream of science. Look forward to identifying the unidentified.
One of my colleagues asked me, why are you studying these things? Why would you do this to yourself? And I said, this really could be the biggest discovery in human history. And as a scientist, I can't walk away from that.
We get reports every night.
I don't know what the hell it is. It's rotating right around it.
Anomalies are observations or phenomena that resist explanation in terms of prevailing beliefs. Anomalies are often not immediately taken seriously by scientists. A really good example of this is meteorites. For centuries, it was denied that rocks fall from the sky. This was a phenomenon that was assumed to be magical in some way. It was widely ridiculed. And then in the last few decades of the 1700s, there were mass sightings and there was material recovered. And a physicist by the name of Ernst Chladni looked at almost 20 cases. And he concluded from this that this phenomenon is actually real. He suggested that these rocks are actually coming from outer space. And so that discovery overturned a widely held idea that interplanetary space is completely empty. And so part of the challenge of scientists is to push aside all of the popular explanations in order to acknowledge the phenomenon itself as real. So in the case of UAP, these phenomena really seem to fall outside of what we expect. And so myself and other scientists have advocated simply for the study of the phenomena. Let's try to detect it and let's try to characterize it.
2017 really started it all. There was a lot going on. You have the New York Times article where we learned that the Pentagon had been studying UFOs for years. And later, there was the release of the 3 Navy videos, which were interesting and exciting. You really had this realization that, oh my God, some aspect of this is real. For me, as a scientist, what's interesting is that the more you get into this, the more unbelievable it gets, which makes you wonder what's really going on. My name is Kevin Knut. I'm a professor of physics at the University at Albany. I mainly focus on studying exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars, but I also do some work related to the physics of UAPs. These are clearly anomalous things that we don't know what they are, and that's exciting. But I had never seen a UAP and didn't have equipment to go look for them, so I just started reading up on them and learning about what has been observed. So I learned about the ATIP program and that our government had been studying UFOs. They defined 5 observables, they called them. 5 characteristics that were unique to UAPs. One of these was transmedium travel, the ability to travel from one medium to another, air to water, typically. Another one is instantaneous acceleration, so these things go from 0 velocity to an extremely high velocity in a very short period of time. Another is hypersonic speeds. That's the ability to fly through the air without a sonic boom or a fireball. Another is low visibility or cloaking. These objects can kind of fade away or disappear and then reappear again. And finally, no apparent propulsion. So objects that are able to fly and we don't know how. Those are very strange behaviors that we really don't understand. And so I thought maybe I can apply what I've done most of my life to cases to try to learn something about UAPs. I focused on the Nimitz 2004 incident because of all of the data that was collected.
In November of 2004, I was a Navy commander, Super Hornet pilot. We were flying, we're training our air crew. The USS Princeton was using their radars to direct us. The ship came up and said, "Hey, sir, we're gonna hold on training today." They said, "Hey, we got real-world investigation. We got an object." They said, we've been seeing these things on radar. We have no idea what they are." To investigate, they turned us off to the west, and they asked what kind of weapons we have on board. So we're kind of doing this, looking around to see where it's at, because it's somewhere around you and you don't know. And I looked down, I go, "What is that?" And I saw a long cylindrical white object, no windows, no wings, no visual signs of propulsion, roughly 40 feet long, that looked like a giant Tic Tac. And this thing was going like this, and I describe it as like if you put a ping pong ball and it was bouncing off a wall. And as I come up, I can see him as he's crossing in front of me. It starts to accelerate, gets right on my nose, and disappears.
The Nimitz case was quite interesting because I could somewhat reliably estimate accelerations and speeds. The radar operator had been noticing that there were objects that would appear on his radar. And these objects would periodically drop from 28,000 feet to sea level in 0.78 seconds. I mean, you're looking at dropping 5.5 miles in less than a second. And if you work through this, you find out that the accelerations are on the order of 5,000 times the acceleration of gravity, which is extremely, that's extremely high acceleration. So, I mean, the F-35 fighter, the wings will rip off at only 13.5 Gs. And we're looking at something like over 5,000 Gs. The altitude and the time that it took for this maneuver were all estimated from the radar data. And we learned about that through speaking with the radar operator. Every time the pilots were being directed to one of these objects, they actually encountered an object. And of course, there was a video that we all saw. So that is evidence that the radar wasn't malfunctioning. So these are real objects doing real things. If the data we have already is accurate, they're clearly going faster than most of our spaceships travel. Could they be interstellar spacecraft, being able to get up to that speed? Yes, they could be interstellar spacecraft. It's really quite shocking. I was always interested in UFOs as I was in space. I was 12 years old when Star Wars came out, so that had quite an impression on me. And around that time, we had the TV show In Search of with Leonard Nimoy. And there were often stories about UFOs in that, which were intriguing and interesting.
They've been seen but fleetingly, and their extraordinary presence creates a frightening mystery.
Of course, I was skeptical, and I'm still skeptical, but you can't be skeptical to the point of shutting down conversation and shutting down exploration and study. That's potentially dangerous, you know, especially when you hear from the Navy. When the Navy is concerned, it's a different issue.
So I think when the Navy comes out and says it's anomalous, I'm going to take them at face value. It means it's unexplained. But the possibility that one of our adversaries has next-generation technology also has to be explored.
While it's possible that they could be the craft from a foreign adversary or experimental craft. It's hard to believe that if that were the case, that they wouldn't be used. They would be incredibly useful for the military. Performing these calculations from the Nimitz case was far more anomalous than what I expected the results to be. Speeds and accelerations were just unreasonable. Not only could these be interstellar craft, but they could be excellent ones. These are huge discoveries that could have a huge impact on humanity. These are something that we really should understand what they are. And of course, you get much less data than you would hope for, so it makes it much harder to study.
So when it comes to doing scientific studies of UFOs and UAPs, I have no problem with that. We just need better data. Understanding why UFOs have been sort of outside of science for so long really comes down to a single term, standards of evidence, which I consider to be the most important and most boring topic in the universe. Science only works because we have very, very rigorous standards for what we consider to be evidence that supports a claim. The Navy pilot videos are only going to take you so far. The problem with them is those cameras are not scientific instruments. That's not what they were designed for. We don't know whether, was this instrument just refurbished? What kind of software does it have? And, you know, that's not the way you take data. You could do the same thing about radar and how often there can be problems. You know, the whole point of science is you have to be able to control your instruments. What needs to happen for a true scientific investigation of UAP phenomena is you build your own instruments, you start from scratch, and you design a research program, and let's see where it leads.
Avi?
Hi, Alex. So you are there already?
Yes, I'm on site.
Okay, we are driving now. My name is Avi Loeb, and currently I'm leading the Galileo project that was established at Harvard University for the scientific research of unidentified anomalous phenomena. I'm a theoretical astrophysicist. I started my career studying the first stars and galaxies. Now I'm also interested in the question of whether UAPs are real. We're heading to Pigeon Run, which is the code name for the Galileo Project Observatory, which is the site where we get data. If there are any UAPs out there, we'll see them. The Galileo project was funded by generous donations at a few $1 million. What we needed is an observatory that monitors the entire sky all the time with fully controlled scientific instruments. This is the scientific approach. At the same time, there is pushback from the scientific community to such studies because it goes against the status quo of saying, we are alone, we haven't seen anything. There are billions of other stars in the Milky Way galaxy alone. By now, we know that a substantial fraction of all stars, maybe a quarter of them, have planets like the Earth, where liquid water may exist on their surface, and the chemistry of life as we know it may blossom. And so the interesting question is, are we alone?
The ultimate question yet unanswered, are we alone in the universe? A Harvard astronomer theorizes it's possible we are not.
On October 19, 2017, the Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii discovered an object that moves very fast, and it was given the name Oumuamua.
Oumuamua was a really exciting event for astronomers. It was the first time we'd ever seen an object coming from outside the solar system that was just passing through. And so what we expected was that it was going to be a comet or an asteroid. But then Avi Loeb said, you know, this could be an interstellar artifact, an artifact of technology.
When Harvard professor Dr. Avi Loeb suggested the new discovery could be a sign of extraterrestrial life, it created a rift in the academic research community.
Oumuamua was discovered by the Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii. They found it was the size of a football field, And what was peculiar about it is that it was most likely flat in its shape based on the reflection of sunlight. And moreover, it was pushed away from the sun by some mysterious force without showing any cometary evaporation. So the question is, what was pushing it away from the sun? My explanation to the unusual propulsion of Oumuamua was that it was pushed by reflecting sunlight. And for that to be the case, the object had to be very thin, like a membrane. And nature doesn't make such objects.
Avi Loeb came out questioning whether it might be some kind of an alien artifact and not a natural object. There was an outcry among the scientific community because to them this was an outrageous claim. There was a lot of pushback on Avi Loeb for daring to draw that kind of conclusion.
People who were, experts in comets were able to postulate that it was perhaps a comet made out of frozen nitrogen, which if it was outgassing, making jets would be very difficult to detect.
One suggestion was put forward that it may be a nitrogen iceberg chipped off the surface of a planet like Pluto that has solid nitrogen on its surface. But we've never seen nitrogen icebergs in the solar system.
Avi Loeb said that basically they were just taking one anomalous possible explanation and replacing it with another anomalous possible explanation. And he didn't believe that that was the right one. For Avi Loeb, the question of what Oumuamua actually was never definitively determined.
One problem with Oumuamua was it came through and it left. So we only had a little while to collect data. And if your claim is we're being visited by aliens from another planet, you're going to need data to be able to even get, a fraction of the way to supporting that claim.
To me, that was a very fair question to put out in the scientific literature. I thought it will inspire us to collect more evidence and encourage future data collection on objects like Oumuamua. The only way for us to arrive at the truth is by collecting evidence. And that's why I established the Galileo project.
Hello, Alex. How are things?
Oh, pretty good.
PTZ is working, connected, or?
Yes,
I
it's
see.
working. I'm going to fine-tune it and do some tests.
Okay, excellent.
My name is Alex Delacroix. My background was a mechanical engineer at Caltech in astrophysics, designing astrophysics instruments. So I design most of the instruments that are here, and I'm assembling them, maintaining them. This is a direct view from the visible camera. You can really increase the size of the image and see exactly what it is. This was a satellite tumbling, as an example. So it's a pretty powerful instrument.
It took 2 years to assemble all the instruments, which include the radio sensors and an acoustic sensor that detects sound from the skies.
We hope to find the unknown, to be able to characterize and give a definition of the object that people have seen for years. It's extremely exciting. It's difficult to stop working on that. So the data we're collecting here are transferred to Harvard for analysis with our AI system that Richard is developing with the team.
We're using artificial intelligence to sort through the data because it just wouldn't be feasible to have people sitting there monitoring cameras entirely for 24/7. Humans are error-prone. So by having artificial intelligence look at our data rather than humans, it's quicker and also it's more reliable. At the moment, the models are very good at just picking out objects in the sky and tracking them, and we are in the process of developing our models to actually differentiate known objects from unknown objects. And it'll output things like, is it a bird, is it an airplane, is it a balloon? And from that, we'll be able to properly analyze whether it's something that's behaving in a way that is not typical of known objects.
We're training the system to report back whether there is anything anomalous, anything that looks unfamiliar. So far, we haven't seen any, but we are just at the beginning. The goal is to build telescope systems and distribute them in many geographical locations. We are currently assembling a second one in Colorado, and my hope is that within the coming years, the observatories of the Galileo project will be able to tell if there is anything out there that appears anomalous. A number of reporters recently gave me the title of the alien hunter. I don't care how you call me.
If a question has huge significance for the future of humanity, you cannot ignore it.
Avi Loeb is far from the first scientist to have been ridiculed for studying UAP. I'm Jacob Haq-Misra. I'm an astrobiologist, and as a scientist, I sometimes do get a little perplexed why there's not more excitement about this UAP topic, because there's something we don't know. It deserves study until we figure out what it is. What got me interested in taking this seriously was when I learned about James McDonald.
In my opinion, the UFO problem is the greatest scientific problem of our times.
James McDonald was an eminent atmospheric physicist, and as an atmospheric scientist, he was especially well equipped to interpret and understand UFO reports, especially anything relating to atmospheric optical phenomena like sundogs. He was very familiar with weather balloons and thought very deeply about how mirages, for example, how high they could be above the horizon.
McDonald was meticulous, and he actually took the time to look into the cases from Project Blue Book, the official longest-term Air Force analysis of UFOs.
My study of the problem leads me to take the position that there has not been application of the best scientific facilities available, adding up to inadequate UFO investigations. I take as an example the Lakenheath case on the east coast of England.
Lakenheath is one of the most bizarre UFO cases in history. In August of 1956, two separate radar stations tracked multiple UFOs, objects moving at 12,000 miles per hour, conducting very, very strange maneuvers. Formations of objects bunching up into one object and then moving off at rapid speeds. That happened in 3 separate occasions.
There was a C-47 pilot at 4,000 feet over the field who, concurrent with the radar, saw a bright object move below his aircraft from west to east. From that time on, both radar and visual observers were available.
So this case was particularly noteworthy to McDonald because it contained all the elements that we hope for a good UFO case. There were numerous pilots that saw these. There was both ground-based and airborne radar that captured these. So multiple modes of collecting data. If, according to McDonald, Project Blue Book had been adequately staffed with scientists who were approaching this with the kind of rigor that he was doing, maybe he would have learned something more instead of just dismissing this as a case that could be explained. So to McDonald, this is one of the truly puzzling cases that should have received much more attention than it did.
To regard this as anything but a problem of considerable scientific importance, I think will be to miss something that we've already missed far too long.
Many people say that, okay, there's no evidence for UFOs. Why are you wasting your time? But it's a catch-22. If nobody ever puts in 1 hour into this research, we will never get the evidence. It's time to think of alternative ways of searching for UFOs around the Earth. So the Galileo project, they are looking for everything that passes on the sky. They are looking also inside our atmosphere. My project is very different. I'm looking very deep into the solar system by using these all photographic plates. My name is Beatrice Villarroel. I'm an astronomer. I work at the Nordic Institute for Theoretical Physics in Stockholm. I lead a project where we are looking for identifiable signatures of alien spaceships.
There are a lot of efforts in the search for life elsewhere that are based on new technologies and collecting new data. But there is also a lot that could potentially be learned from archival sources of data. Perhaps the discovery of extraterrestrial life is already on some photographic plate and we just haven't looked at it right.
The first thing I used was images from the Palomar Observatory in the early 1950s. In the past, when one was taking images of the sky, one had these big glass plates, and one put it in the telescope and let it expose an image for maybe 50 minutes, like films. So we started studying these plates. I was sitting with 24,000 images, and I looked them through one by one myself. Then I found that we had one image where 9 objects seemed to appear and vanish within 1 hour, which was completely crazy. Because a star is not going to appear and vanish within 1 hour. That's completely unthinkable. When I first found the 9 transients, I thought that something must be wrong. It's a transient, a short-lived astrophysical phenomenon that you see, something that changes, like a supernova is a transient, a comet is a transient.
One of the values in the approach Beatrice is taking, using historical plates, these are astronomical observations of the sky before the satellite era. This is before Sputnik launched, before we had anything else artificial orbiting the planet. So if you find evidence of some sort of transient object in the sky during the early 1950s, it can't be a human satellite, so what is it?
So we started studying this case, and we started doing all kind of tests to see what could be wrong with the image. We were worried that this could be some kind of plate defects. Let's say some kind of scratch on the plate. The thing with these plate defects is that they usually have random shapes. There is no reason why they would get a perfect star-like shape. It can happen maybe once, but our issue was that we had 9 of them. It seems pretty unlikely. And we have kept finding examples of these interesting images of transients and vanishing objects. So here we see 3 stars, looking just like any other of the bright stars in the same field. They are there, and you can't see them if you compare to the other image that is taken later. More excitingly and more recently, we found our absolutely best candidates for alien probes around the Earth. So what you're seeing here are 5 flashes of light, and if you look there, they are not seen later. They are also lying along a narrow stripe. The probability to find 5 random objects lying along this stripe is 1 in 10,000. If it's along one line, it could in principle be one object, something that is moving. So it's a quite interesting image. It's a very unlikely alignment. We had to rule out every astronomical phenomenon we could think of, like comets, asteroids, supernova.
The biggest criticism of Beatrice's work is that it's very, very difficult to explain what it is you found. So if you're left with something that you can't understand, and you perhaps have extraordinary hypotheses, like maybe these are extraterrestrials, maybe they are, but how do you know? How do you follow up on an observation that was taken over 50 years ago?
Photographic plates capture one single image. We want to have multiple images of the same phenomenon before we can claim a real ET probe. But there's 2 fun coincidences when it comes to the dates of these transients. So the triple transient happens on the 19th of July, 1952. And the second from the 27th of July, 1952. They coincide with one of the most famous UFO flyovers called the Washington, D.C. flyover.
In the summer of 1952, over 2 consecutive weekends, was perhaps the most significant wave of UFO sightings in U.S. history.
Air traffic controllers could see multiple mysterious objects moving on their radars. And also, there were many witnesses, like pilots and stewards, that saw mysterious objects. The US Air Force held a press conference to discuss the flying saucer invasion. During this press conference, they said that everything were misidentifications, and this was based on the interpretation of an astronomer called Donald Menzel.
A layer of warm, dry air will bend the radar beam back to Earth. This was what happened in Washington in 1952.
Donald Menzel was a scientist who worked with Project Blue Book, and he took it to be one of his personal tasks in his career to challenge and debunk many of these UFO cases. Menzel and McDonald definitely went head-to-head many times.
Dr. Mitchell, I cannot agree with the optical, physical, astronomical principles. I do not believe they represent scientifically sound analyses. But it's time that we put an end to chasing ghosts, hobgoblins, visions, and hallucinations. And as for the true believers, bless their little hearts, let them go on believing in UFOs, fairies, or Santa Claus if they want to.
Professor McDonald, you have been highly critical of your own government's attitude towards UFOs.
Indeed I have, yes. Taken a very good look at the American Official Investigation Program, Project Blue Book, run by the Air Force, and I have quite unequivocally described it to scientific colleagues back in the States as superficial and incompetent.
As McDonald became more interested and especially vocal in his advocacy for studying UFOs, it definitely led him to professional isolation. He received not just pushback, but ridicule and harassment.
In 1971, he testified in front of Congress, not about UFOs, but about dangers to the ozone layer.
McDonald was one of the very first atmospheric scientists worried about the ozone layer.
One of the members of Congress asked, basically, if you believe in little green men and flying saucers, how can I take your testimony on the depletion of the ozone layer seriously?
This completely discredited his testimony. And in science, your reputation is everything. Ultimately, his funding sources were attacked and taken away.
It did not take a good toll on his mental health, arguably, and unfortunately, he died at the age of 51. He was found in the desert with a gun and what appears to be a suicide note. We can only speculate as to what was really going on in his head. I think there were some things going on in his personal life that may have been a factor. But of course, when you face significant pushback from your colleagues for doing what you believe is acting in integrity as a scientist, one can only imagine that that might have been at least a factor in what led him to such a terrible end. For scientists who believe that there is something to be studied, McDonald, he created the template for how to do this. And he inspired scientists to talk about things, even if there might be backlash, there might be stigmatization.
This is a turning point, and there's a whole expanding field of scientists who agree that the data is interesting and worth following up.
The objective here is to bring people like this together to legitimize and professionalize your ideas.
The Sol Foundation is a research think tank set up by Professor Gary Nolan and his colleague Peter Skafish to pull together some of the best thinkers and scientists who are looking into the UAP issue.
I think the Sol Foundation is meant to be an agent of change. Here you now have everybody realizing that it's possible to talk about this and that they're not going to be booed out of the room. My name is Gary Nolan. I'm a professor in the Department of Pathology at the Stanford University of Medicine. I'm a laboratory scientist. I'm a practicing scientist. My laboratory focuses largely on biology in cancer and autoimmune diseases.
Some scientists have been looking out into the universe or even in our own atmosphere to try to study UFOs. Others are focused on collecting materials from sites where UFOs have supposedly either crashed or landed to just try and understand the nature of the material that is associated with the craft.
How do you get involved in UFOs?
So it was actually rather unexpected. Around 2012, I got a knock on my door in my office at Stanford, and there were these two gentlemen standing there outside from the CIA and a aeronautics corporation. They started talking about UFOs, and they wanted my help. To be honest, at the time, I thought it was a joke. I actually thought it was a candid camera moment of some sort. I kept looking around to see if there was a camera somewhere else pointed at me. But they were serious and deadly serious. I couldn't get them to laugh about anything. They had heard that my lab had made one of the deepest immune profiling devices in the world, the mass spectrometer.
With mass spectrometry, you essentially can analyze samples and figure out what atoms and what molecules are in that sample. Is this something we know, or is this something unusual?
What the CIA wanted from me was help in understanding the blood of people who had claimed that they had seen UFOs, to help them understand what had happened to these people. But as I got deeper and deeper into it, it became pretty clear that several of these patients, these events had happened to them up to a decade before. And so there wasn't going to be anything I would be able to find in the blood. But as I developed a relationship with these individuals from the CIA, they started saying, okay, well, we also have these materials that supposedly some of these craft had left behind. What would you do with them?
Gary Nolan's mass spectrometer can analyze the composition of blood samples, and it can do the same thing for non-biological physical materials. After Gary got involved with doing some of these studies with the physical material, he met Jacques Vallée, because Jacques Vallée had been interested in the very same thing for decades.
Welcome back to On the Record. Dr. Jacques Vallée is an astrophysicist who provided the inspiration for the character of the French scientist in the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Il s'agit d'un petit groupe de gens. This is a small group of people qui ont eu la même vision en même temps, who have shared a vision in common. Look.
Jacques Vallée is probably one of the best-known thinkers in the area of anomalous phenomena.
You are something of an anomaly. I mean, a real scientist who's studying what's described as
there are a few of us. There are a few of us. Most of them stay underground because they don't want to put their jobs in jeopardy.
Tell me how long you have been looking at UFOs, UAP.
I've lost count of that. My background has been mostly in computer science. I've built about 15 different databases on UFOs. And I've investigated cases all over the world. And I started gathering materials or metals that were deposited around encounters with UFOs and UFO observations.
That mass spectrometer and the ability to measure metals was, I think, what triggered Jacques' interest, because he had these metals, and it was like, well, okay, can you help us analyze these materials? So Jacques, start with the new cases.
There was an observation of a large, bright object close to a road. Now we have the actual material.
He came with some simple materials at the beginning, and as the results started getting more interesting, he brought some more interesting materials to study, like the Council Bluffs story, as an example. 1977, Council Bluffs, Iowa. At least 3 groups of people saw a object, or these lights that were in the sky, and something appeared to drop from the object.
There were 11 witnesses in 3 different locations. All their views converged over that particular spot. And then the people who were in the park itself found that there was a mass of metal. It was melting, it was red.
Somebody along the way called the police. The police arrived very quickly thereafter. Jacques did get a piece of the material from one of the witnesses, and he got the original photographs, the Polaroids, from the police. So, you know, I mean, this is about as good as it gets.
So how do you get half a ton of molten steel falling from the sky? That's what we have to explain. The case at Council Bluffs, it's certainly an interesting whodunit. Now, at the time, people thought it could be a satellite re-entry. So this escalated to NASA and to the Air Force. Everybody was on the same team, which is very rare. All the hypotheses were looked at in detail by professional investigators. So the first thing they thought it might be was a Russian satellite. But satellite debris is not molten when it gets to the ground.
It was clear it wasn't a meteor, because a meteor doesn't leave pools of molten metal on the ground. A meteor leaves a hole.
So all that was eliminated one by one. Then NASA and the Air Force gave up their investigation. So this was perfect for Dr. Nolan to start looking, because we knew this was a real case.
And so we start analyzing what it's made of.
In 2021, Gary Nolan and Jacques Vallée published the results of their study. They were able to present some unusual properties of this material.
In the Council Bluffs event, the material on the ground was incompletely mixed, which is strange because, for instance, if you're making cement, you add all the constituents and then you mix them thoroughly, because if they're not thoroughly mixed, you're going to get cracks. That's a flaw in the structure, and then the thing will break.
You don't find partially mixed compounds being used for industrial purposes, and especially not out in the middle of nowhere, dropping off some kind of object in the sky in a molten state. The fact that it's incompletely mixed just makes it even stranger.
These objects are not just natural. The objects are manufactured in some manner, part of some industrial process that had engineered them. Now, there have been all kinds of attempts to disprove it, even recently, somebody claiming it was just a hoax. Well, could somebody have carried this much metal here? What's the closest foundry where such metal might be produced? There was none anywhere nearby. There were no railway cars that had gone nearby. There were no tire tracks anywhere nearby that would show that it had been dumped. I'm not saying that it proves that it's a UAP. These are just all intriguing data points, and so I wanted to study as many materials as possible. We're actually setting up standardized testing, basically creating a federation of other scientists who can analyze the data freely available. I can't look at everything and know the answers, but I want to get the data out there so everybody can.
I think there's a lesson there that you don't want to be alone raising the issue. You have to build a coalition first. And I think that's what we're seeing now. We can have a coalition of scientists, but one man is not going to get anywhere. Dr. McDonald was a single scientist, and he was essentially dismissed. Didn't really get a real study going.
But the impact that James McDonald had is important because he advocated for a scientific approach to UFOs. They should be studied in detail with multiple types of instruments, which is what we're trying to do today. There should be multiple disciplines involved, such as physics, chemistry, biology.
With the UAP phenomena, the alternative explanations are narrowing, are being reduced. And that to me is exciting, because if the answer is that these things are not from here, that's an even bigger turning point for humanity.
I saw this bright white light. I suddenly felt weird, and I felt like my skin was on fire. I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm dead.
If you talk to experiencers, their story is going to get really weird really fast.
I can remember being levitated out of the car.
When you're sitting with an experiencer, it feels like there has been something traumatic that has happened.
You have a mystery that big, it's valuable to study it. There's a lot that can be learned from experiencers.
And I looked up, and all of a sudden I'm like, I'm on a UFO.